Welcome back to Strategic Isomorphism, uncovering parallel logics of power across organizations. I'm Kaede, and if you've been with us for episodes 1 and 2, you'll recall we've explored how remarkably similar control structures emerge across diverse organizations and how economic leverage tactics converge despite radically different contexts. Today, we're shifting our focus to what might be the organizational equivalent of dating apps, how organizations find partners to achieve what they can't accomplish alone. In our previous episode on economic leverage, we saw how organizations from the Yakuza to tech platforms use strikingly similar tactics to make others do what they want through economic pain and pleasure. Today, we'll examine how these same diverse entities form strategic partnerships to enhance their capabilities and manage risks, essentially discovering that whether you're a crime syndicate expanding territory or a corporation entering a new market, you'll eventually need friends with benefits, just with different terminology and considerably different partnership agreements. Our theoretical frameworks today include network theory concepts like brokerage and structural holes, strategic management approaches to alliance formation, and institutional perspectives on interorganizational relationships. While acknowledging the profound differences in formality and legality across contexts, we'll focus on the functional similarities that reveal strategic isomorphism in action. As we discovered with control structures and economic leverage, these alliance strategies show remarkable convergence. Whether it's criminal families collaborating on larger operations, nations forming military alliances, or corporations developing joint ventures. It's all about finding partners who bring complementary capabilities to the table, just with different logos on the partnership announcement. Let's begin by examining how diverse organizations pool resources and capabilities to achieve what they couldn't accomplish alone. A universal approach that works whether you're wearing a military uniform or a corporate hoodie. At the core of strategic partnerships across organizational contexts lies the fundamental logic of resource and capability pooling, combining complementary strengths to achieve what neither partner could accomplish alone. It's the organizational equivalent of realizing you need a roommate to afford a better apartment, just with billions of dollars and complex legal agreements at stake. Yakuza family cooperation operates through cross-family operations that leverage specialized capabilities from different groups. One family might provide territorial access, while another contributes specialized enforcement skills, creating synergies that enhance overall effectiveness. State, military, and economic alliances function through similar logic, but with formal treaties, aggregating resources through structures like NATO, the European Union, or ASEAN to achieve collective security and economic advantages impossible for individual nations. Political coalitions extend this approach through combining voting power to achieve legislative goals, essentially acknowledging that in politics, as in crime and international relations, you rarely have enough power alone to get what you want. Corporate partnerships mirror these approaches through joint ventures that combine market access and technical capabilities, strategic alliances that leverage complementary strengths, and technology sharing agreements that accelerate innovation through collaboration. Digital platform collaboration has evolved this model through API integration, allowing technical interoperability, data sharing agreements that enhance mutual capabilities, and cross-platform functionality that creates seamless user experiences across previously separate systems. What's particularly fascinating is the emergence of intermunicipal networks for digital transformation, knowledge sharing, local governments forming alliances to share expertise and resources for technological advancement, essentially applying the same partnership logic as corporations, but in the public sector context. The universal synergistic logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent. combining complementary capabilities to create mutual benefit that exceeds what either partner could achieve independently. Implementation variations primarily reflect legitimacy differences rather than functional distinctions. Formal contracts versus handshake agreements, legal versus illegal purposes, public versus private arrangements. But the resource-sharing mechanisms remain strikingly similar. Current examples abound in green innovation partnerships, where companies combine technical expertise with market access to accelerate sustainability initiatives, and semiconductor manufacturing alliances, where nations and corporations collaborate to secure critical technology supply chains. The consistent emergence of these resource pooling approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal challenge of acquiring capabilities you lack through partnership rather than development or acquisition. Beyond pooling capabilities, organizations across contexts use strategic partnerships as sophisticated risk diversification mechanisms, essentially discovering that in an uncertain world, it's better not to put all your eggs in one basket, especially when those eggs might be illegal, politically volatile, or subject to market disruption. The Yakuza approaches this challenge through distributing law enforcement exposure across operations, partnering with other criminal groups to spread risk, so that if one operation is compromised, others remain viable. It's criminal portfolio theory, diversifying your illegal activities to reduce overall risk. State alliance deterrence functions through similar logic, but with sovereign authority, creating collective security arrangements like NATO that make aggression against any member prohibitively costly for potential adversaries. Political alliances extend this approach through coalition formation that buffers against electoral volatility, creating broader support bases that can withstand shifting political winds. Corporate risk management mirrors these approaches through supply chain diversification partnerships that reduce dependency on single sources and market hedging relationships that protect against regional economic downturns. Digital platforms have adapted this strategy through multi-platform presence that reduces dependency risks, ensuring their services are available across competing ecosystems to avoid being hostage to any single platform's policies. Green innovation partnerships represent a particularly notable application, with companies forming alliances to distribute environmental compliance costs and risks that would be prohibitively expensive for individual firms to bear alone. The universal uncertainty logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent, mitigating threats through collective arrangements that distribute risk across multiple entities. Implementation examples abound in today's complex environment. The US-Japan-South Korea Semiconductor Alliance formed to reduce dependency on Chinese manufacturing, corporate climate adaptation consortiums sharing costs of resilience infrastructure, and cross-sector partnerships addressing systemic risks too large for any single organization to manage. Cross-context patterns reveal striking similarities in threat identification processes, collective response mechanisms, and mutual insurance functions. Current research indicates organizations with diversified alliance portfolios demonstrate 43% greater resilience to market shocks, essentially confirming the revolutionary insight that not putting all your eggs in one basket actually works. A discovery that surely deserves recognition in the obvious, but we needed data category. The consistent emergence of these risk diversification approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal challenge of managing uncertainty through collective action rather than individual exposure. Whether you're a crime syndicate worried about law enforcement, a nation concerned about military threats, or a corporation hedging against market volatility, the fundamental logic of distributing risk through strategic partnerships remains remarkably consistent. Beyond capability enhancement and risk management, organizations across contexts form strategic partnerships specifically to manage rivalry and competition, essentially discovering that sometimes the enemy of my enemy is my friend, regardless of whether you're fighting over territory, market share, or research grants. The Yakuza manages intergroup conflict through formal peace pacts that prevent destructive competition and counter-rival alliances that combine strength against common threats, essentially acknowledging that even in criminal enterprises, unbridled competition can be bad for business. State balancing behaviors function through similar logic, but with diplomatic frameworks, forming coalitions against regional hegemons that might otherwise dominate. The ongoing efforts to balance China's influence in the Indo-Pacific providing a perfect contemporary example. Political competitive positioning extends this approach through strategic endorsements that combine electoral strength and opposition bloc formation that enhances collective bargaining power, essentially applying the same alliance logic to democratic competition that nations apply to geopolitical rivalry. Corporate competitive alliances mirror these approaches through standard-setting consortiums that shape market rules in their collective favor and industry associations that advocate for shared interests against regulatory or market threats. Digital platform coalitions have adapted this strategy through competitive alliances against dominant players. Smaller companies combining forces to challenge platform giants through technical interoperability and policy advocacy. What's particularly revealing is how academic institutions demonstrate the same isomorphic patterns, forming research consortiums to compete more effectively for limited funding, essentially applying the same competitive alliance logic to scholarly pursuits that corporations apply to markets. The universal competitive logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent, enhancing strategic position through collective action against rivals too powerful to challenge individually. Implementation variations primarily reflect legitimacy differences rather than functional distinctions. Formal treaties versus handshake agreements, legal versus illegal mechanisms, public versus private arrangements. But the alliance formation patterns remain strikingly similar. Current examples abound in the digital economy. Open-source alliances forming against proprietary platforms, regional trade blocs developing to enhance collective bargaining power, and industry coalitions advocating for favorable regulatory frameworks. The consistent emergence of these competitive alliance approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal challenge of enhancing competitive position through collaboration rather than individual confrontation. Whether you're a crime syndicate facing a larger rival, a nation balancing against a regional power, or a corporation challenging a dominant competitor, the fundamental logic of forming alliances to enhance competitive position remains remarkably consistent, proving that across contexts, organizations independently discover that sometimes you need friends to help you fight your enemies. The final core driver of strategic partnerships across organizational contexts is opportunity and access exploitation. The use of alliances to enter new markets, access resources, or reach constituencies that would otherwise remain inaccessible. It's the organizational equivalent of befriending someone because they have a beach house, just with more complex strategic objectives and occasionally more prison time. The Yakuza develops international partnerships with criminal organizations in other countries to access new markets for illicit goods and services, essentially applying the same market expansion logic through alliance that legitimate businesses use, just with different products and risk profiles. State trade agreements function through similar logic, but with diplomatic frameworks, creating preferential access arrangements that give domestic businesses advantages in foreign markets and establishing economic opportunity zones that attract investment through favorable terms. Political coalitions extend this approach through voter bloc relationships that access previously unreachable constituencies and interest group alliances that tap into new resource streams, essentially acknowledging that in politics, as in business and crime, you often need partners to reach new customers. Corporate market expansion strategies mirror these approaches through distribution partnerships that leverage local knowledge and connections, localization alliances that adapt offerings to specific cultural contexts, and joint ventures that combine complementary capabilities for new market entry. Academic institutions demonstrate the same patterns through cross-institutional research proposals designed to access funding sources that would be unavailable to individual organizations, essentially applying the same opportunity-seeking logic to scholarly pursuits that corporations apply to markets. Digital platform partnerships have perfected this approach through ecosystem expansion strategies that integrate complementary services, creating mutually beneficial relationships where each partner gains access to the other's user base. The universal opportunity logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent, accessing new resources, markets, or constituencies through collaborative relationships that provide mutual benefits. Implementation examples abound in today's complex environment. China's Belt and Road Initiative providing infrastructure investment in exchange for strategic influence, corporate partnerships targeting emerging markets where local knowledge is essential, and cross-sector alliances addressing complex opportunities too large for any single organization to capture alone. Cross-context patterns reveal striking similarities in gateway identification processes, access negotiation approaches, and mutual benefit structures. Current research indicates cross-border partnerships have increased 37% since 2020, despite rising geopolitical tensions, essentially confirming that opportunity seeking through alliance transcends even significant political barriers. The consistent emergence of these opportunity exploitation approaches across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action. Convergent solutions to the universal challenge of accessing new resources through partnership rather than direct entry. Whether you're a crime syndicate entering a new territory, a nation seeking economic advantage, or a corporation targeting an emerging market, the fundamental logic of forming alliances to access new opportunities remains remarkably consistent, proving that across contexts, organizations independently discover that the right partners can open doors that would otherwise remain closed. A particularly fascinating aspect of strategic partnerships emerges in cross-border knowledge transfer challenges. The difficulties organizations face when attempting to share practices, technologies, or approaches across different contexts. It's the organizational equivalent of discovering that your perfect dance moves don't work at all when the music changes, just with billion-dollar investments and international reputations at stake. The concept of contextual embeddedness helps explain why practices that work brilliantly in one setting often fail in another. Organizational approaches are deeply intertwined with their cultural, institutional, and social environments. Transfer barriers emerge at multiple levels. Country-level challenges include regulatory differences that make certain practices illegal or impractical, cultural norms that affect acceptance and interpretation, and institutional frameworks that support or undermine particular approaches. Organization-level barriers include structural compatibility issues between partners, absorptive capacity limitations that prevent effective adoption, and cultural alignment challenges that create resistance to external practices. Individual-level obstacles include knowledge tacitness, where critical aspects remain uncodified and difficult to articulate, relationship quality affecting information flow, and trust dynamics determining willingness to share sensitive information. Strategic responses to these challenges include adaptation strategies that modify practices to fit local contexts, contextual translation approaches that preserve core functions while changing forms, and hybrid approaches that combine elements from multiple systems to create contextually appropriate solutions. Multinational organizations face particularly complex challenges balancing global integration with local responsiveness, essentially navigating the tension between standardization for efficiency and adaptation for effectiveness. Digital transformation has created new dimensions to these challenges, with virtual collaboration tools showing effectiveness reduced by 23% when used across cultures compared to within homogeneous teams, essentially confirming that Zoom doesn't magically solve cross-cultural communication challenges. The universal knowledge transfer logic underlying these diverse approaches is remarkably consistent. Practices must be translated rather than merely transplanted, with careful attention to contextual factors that determine effectiveness. Implementation examples abound in failed technology transfers, where technical solutions were implemented without consideration of local contexts, alongside successful adaptation cases where organizations invested in understanding and accommodating contextual differences. Cross-context patterns reveal striking similarities in adaptation challenges despite different partnership types. Whether sharing manufacturing techniques, governance approaches, or digital systems, the same fundamental translation challenges emerge. Current research indicates culturally adapted partnerships demonstrate 57% greater success rates than direct transplantation approaches, essentially confirming that context matters profoundly in determining practice effectiveness. The consistent emergence of these knowledge transfer challenges across different organizational contexts demonstrates strategic isomorphism in action, convergent solutions to the universal challenge of adapting practices across contextual boundaries. Whether you're a criminal organization expanding internationally, a corporation entering emerging markets, or a government agency implementing borrowed policies, the fundamental logic of contextual translation remains remarkably consistent, proving that across contexts, organizations independently discover that what works here may not work there without thoughtful adaptation. The Global Semiconductor Manufacturing Alliance landscape, from 2020 to 2025, provides a perfect case study of strategic partnerships that mirror approaches used across organizational contexts. Essentially, nations and corporations independently discovering that chip manufacturing is too complex, expensive, and strategically vital to go it alone. The timeline reveals a classic alliance formation pattern. The US-Japan-South Korea trilateral partnership formalized in 2022 to counter China's growing influence. The US CHIPS Act allocating $52.7 billion in subsidies to attract domestic production. The EU Chips Act mobilizing €43 billion for European semiconductor sovereignty. Cross-sector corporate alliances forming around these regional manufacturing hubs. And China's counter-strategy, investing a staggering $143 billion in domestic chip development. The alliance drivers precisely match those we've identified across contexts. Supply chain security representing risk diversification through reduced dependency on single sources, technological sovereignty reflecting capability enhancement through pooled resources, and competitive positioning against rival blocs demonstrating classic balancing behavior. What's particularly revealing from an isomorphism perspective is how nation-states and corporations formed parallel alliance structures. Governments creating policy frameworks and financial incentives, while companies established joint ventures and technology sharing agreements that mirrored the same strategic logic at different scales. Implementation challenges reflected the cross-border knowledge transfer issues we discussed earlier. Cultural differences affecting collaboration effectiveness, intellectual property protection, concerns limiting information sharing, and tacit knowledge barriers making some manufacturing expertise difficult to transfer between contexts. Applying our theoretical frameworks, we can see resource dependency driving alliance formation as organizations sought to secure access to critical components, competitive alliance dynamics as blocs formed against perceived threats, and risk diversification as both nations and companies sought to reduce vulnerability to supply chain disruptions. The outcome patterns followed predictable sequences observed across contexts. Regional manufacturing clusters emerging around policy incentives, knowledge sharing increasing within alliance blocs while decreasing between competing groups, and competitive innovation accelerating as rival alliances raced to develop next-generation technologies. What makes this case study so valuable for understanding strategic isomorphism is how clearly it demonstrates that despite the profound differences between nation-states and corporations, the fundamental logic of alliance formation remains remarkably consistent. Both types of entities independently developed identical partnership strategies to address the same underlying challenges of capability enhancement, risk management, and competitive positioning. The convergence of these alliance approaches across radically different organizational contexts reveals strategic isomorphism in action. Different entities independently developing identical strategies to solve similar partnership challenges. Our examination of strategic partnerships across diverse organizational contexts reveals clear patterns of strategic isomorphism with significant theoretical and practical implications. It's like discovering that despite their different vocabularies, a crime boss, a national leader, and a tech CEO are all reading from the same alliance playbook. We've observed all three types of isomorphism identified by DiMaggio and Powell. Coercive isomorphism, where regulatory requirements drive similar alliance structures across organizations. Mimetic isomorphism, where organizations copy apparently successful partnership models rather than developing novel approaches. And normative isomorphism, where professional standards create convergent alliance practices across otherwise different contexts. The connection to resource dependence theory is particularly illuminating. Control of critical resources drives remarkably similar alliance patterns despite profoundly different contexts. Whether securing access to raw materials, market entry, or technological capabilities, the power to provide valuable resources produces consistent strategic behaviors. Game theory helps explain why these patterns emerge independently across contexts. Strategic interactions follow similar logic regardless of players when the fundamental structure of the game remains consistent. Whether you're a nation forming a military alliance or a corporation entering a joint venture, the strategic calculation of costs, benefits, and potential partner responses follows identical patterns. The practical implications are significant for understanding organizational behavior. Alliance strategies transcend organizational types, allowing insights from one domain to inform expectations in another. Understanding alliance patterns helps predict organizational behavior across apparently unrelated contexts. And digital transformation is changing implementation mechanisms, but not the fundamental logic of partnership formation. This analysis raises important strategic questions for all organizations. When do alliances create sustainable versus temporary advantage? Partnerships may yield short-term benefits, but create long-term dependencies. How do organizations balance cooperation and competition in partnerships? The inherent tension between sharing and protecting capabilities challenges all alliances. What ethical boundaries should constrain alliance formation tactics? The legitimacy of partnership strategies varies dramatically across contexts, despite functional similarities. By understanding the parallel logics that drive alliance formation across contexts, leaders can make more informed decisions about which partnerships to pursue and how to structure them for mutual benefit, potentially finding more sustainable approaches to collaboration rather than merely copying alliance models that generate temporary advantage but lasting vulnerabilities. To conclude our analysis of strategic partnerships across diverse organizational contexts, I'll highlight our key findings. First, alliance strategies show remarkable convergence despite profound contextual differences, from criminal organizations to nation-states, from political administrations to tech platforms. Fundamentally different entities develop strikingly similar approaches to forming partnerships for strategic advantage. It's like discovering that despite their different exteriors, a protection racket and a corporate joint venture are running on the same collaborative operating system. Alliance patterns consistently emerge across these contexts: resource pooling to enhance capabilities, risk diversification to manage uncertainties, and competitive positioning to gain advantage against rivals. Understanding isomorphic alliance tactics helps predict organizational behavior across apparently unrelated domains. The same partnership logic that explains a nation's military alliance can illuminate a platform's developer ecosystem strategy. Our key insights illuminate why these patterns persist. Resource dependency functions as a universal driver for alliance formation, because controlling access to valuable resources creates leverage regardless of context. Digital platforms reinvent traditional partnership tactics through technological means, essentially digitizing age-old collaboration strategies rather than fundamentally transforming them. The evidence is compelling. The US-Japan-South Korea Semiconductor Alliance formed specifically to counter China's growing influence in the chip industry. The EU Chips Act mobilized €43 billion to establish European semiconductor sovereignty through strategic partnerships, and cross-border partnerships increased 37% since 2020, despite rising geopolitical tensions, demonstrating how alliance formation often transcends even significant political barriers. Strategic isomorphism in partnership strategies isn't merely an academic curiosity. It's a powerful force shaping how organizations collaborate with others, often unconsciously adopting approaches from apparently unrelated contexts that face similar underlying challenges of resource acquisition, risk management, and competitive positioning. The next time you see a platform announce a new developer partnership program or a nation form a trade alliance, remember you're witnessing the same fundamental collaboration strategy at work. Different packaging, same function of pooling resources and capabilities for mutual advantage. Sometimes understanding organizational behavior is simply recognizing that however different the players, the game of strategic partnership remains remarkably consistent. In our next episode, we'll explore maintaining order, convergent mechanisms for internal governance, examining how diverse organizations establish and enforce internal rules despite their different contexts and purposes. If this episode was about how organizations join forces with others, our next episode is about how they maintain order within their own ranks, creating systems that define acceptable behavior and consequences for deviation. We'll investigate how criminal organizations, state actors, political administrations, and technology companies all utilize remarkably similar approaches to setting norms, resolving disputes, and sanctioning rule violations, essentially discovering that whether you're running a government agency or a street gang, you'll eventually need a code of conduct and a way to enforce it. We'll analyze striking similarities in socialization processes that inculcate organizational values, examine parallel strategies for dispute resolution that maintain internal cohesion, and uncover how sanctioning systems create consequences for rule violations across organizational types. From a corporation's HR policies to a criminal syndicate's code of honor, we'll see how the same fundamental governance logics appear in dramatically different contexts, but serve identical functions, defining the rules of the game and ensuring members play by them. As you observe different organizations between now and our next episode, watch for these patterns. Norm-setting processes that define acceptable behavior, dispute resolution mechanisms that handle internal conflicts, and sanctioning systems that create consequences for rule violations. This is Kaede, signing off until next time, when we'll continue our exploration of strategic isomorphism by examining how organizations across contexts discover that maintaining internal order is just as challenging as achieving external goals. Remember that understanding parallel organizational logics isn't merely academic. It provides practical insight into how governance operates across contexts, revealing the common patterns beneath apparently different rule systems. After all, whether it's a corporate code of conduct or a criminal organization's honor code, the logic of internal governance remains remarkably consistent.